This Fish Eater Friday, we have a very important question which I have not touched on. Father, this is not on the topic. That's the video he posted to. But I have a question. But first off, some scriptural passages. Isaiah 66:21. And I will also take of them for priests and for Levites, saith the Lord. Jeremiah 33:18. And the Levitical priest shall never lack a man in my presence to offer burnt offerings, to burn grain offerings, and to make sacrifices forever. Malachi 1:11. For from the rising of the sun even unto the going down of the same, my name shall be great among the Gentiles, and in every place incense shall be offered unto my name, and a pure offering. For my name shall be great among the brethren, saith the Lord of hosts. The question. I need to go to confession. The traditionalists have said the new priesthood ordination is invalid. Yet the written word says there shall never be a man lacking in this Levitical priesthood that you hold, and the Mass will continue daily. Whom can I confess? There are a couple questions here. In a separate video, I'll address the question of how the Mass fails entirely and the priesthood survives. But we'll go to the question here. Whom can I confess? Where can I go to confession? Seems rather simple. Find a valid priest, right? Well, I'm going to go to Priest Problems by Mahoney. In a certain church, a number of visiting priests kneel in the church to make their thanksgiving after Mass. Are they justified in hearing the confessions of the faithful when requested, even though they lack faculties in this or any other diocese, and even though there may be other priests available, properly approved, who can easily be asked? The alleged justification is that people in general think that all priests are able to hear confessions anywhere. And this is the problem today. People think that any priest can hear confessions. If he's a valid priest, he can hear confessions and validly absolve. He can validly say the Mass, we know that. He can validly baptize. Anyone can validly baptize. He can validly administer extreme unction, etc., etc. What about confession? Mahoney then quotes in Latin Canons 209, 872, and 874, which discuss jurisdiction, and 2366. Then he replies, the view which justifies hearing confession in the above circumstances is often followed in practice. Now we're looking here, let's take a look at the date, in 1958. In other words, this is already being done. We think unhesitatingly that it is the wrong view because it nullifies the principle requiring jurisdiction as well as holy orders for the valid absolution of sin. A principle which is dogmatic and not merely canonical. Then he goes on to discuss the question in more detail. It is a dogma of the divine and Catholic faith that a priest requires, besides holy orders, jurisdiction over the penitent to validly absolve from his sins. I'd like to read a proposition. After the institution of dioceses and parishes, it is fitting that each one exercise this judgment in confession over those persons subject to him, either by reason of territory or some personal right, because otherwise confusion and disturbance would be introduced. Pope Pius VI condemned this proposition of the Jansenist Epistua. Quote, since it declares that in order to prevent confusion, after dioceses and parishes have been instituted, it is merely fitting that the power of absolving be exercised on subjects, so understood as if for the valid use of this power there is no need of ordinary or delegated jurisdiction, without which the Tridentine Synod declares that absolution conferred by a priest is of no value, as false, rash, dangerous, contrary, and injurious to the Tridentine Synod. This is the point that got me thinking in latter part of 1983. It was this matter of jurisdiction confession. I hadn't read this in Priest Problems. I didn't get this book until 84. But I was rereading Canon 209, and studying this matter, and I read 872, which is a canon that tells us that a priest has to have jurisdiction in the first place. And so let's get to canon 209, because we're going to hear about this one. The church supplies jurisdiction both for the external and the internal form in common error, in a positive and probable doubt whether a fact or law. This canon was circulated in the early 1970s to justify traditionalists operating. And we misinterpreted common error. We said there's error from Vatican II, the Novus Ordo, the Conciliar Church. And it's common to everyone who claims to be Catholic. But that's not what common error means. It's a legal term. Common error means that the parish, for instance, all think that the priest that's been sent as their pastor is validly appointed as their pastor, although actually there's some defect in his appointment as pastor. They don't know this. This is common error. And the church supplies for this, for the good of the faithful who think that this man is truly their pastor. Okay, when in actual fact he is not. There's been some mess up in the paperwork. That's what common error is about. What we have had happen is the emphasis has always been on the validity of holy orders, the sacraments. That's what we heard in the 70s. Matter, form, intention. The new rite of ordination, as referenced in this question, does not measure up. Matter, form, and intention are doubtful in ordination, and I think certainly lacking in consecration of a bishop. And so the Conciliar Church has invalid orders, and the man who is their Pope, Francis, George Bergoglio, is not even a valid priest. He might be a valid deacon. He might have got in under the wire. I haven't looked that up. It's not important. Validity alone is not sufficient to absolve from sins. We've discussed that. Okay, now who can absolve me from my sins? Let's say you're a regular Catholic. Who can absolve you from your sins? I can as Pope. The Pope has authority over everyone in the world, every Catholic, every baptized person. Your diocesan bishop, the bishop of your diocese, not the bishop of the next door diocese, but your bishop, the diocesan bishop, not just any man consecrated bishop. Your pastor, the pastor of your parish, those have what we call ordinary jurisdiction. Now, I as Pope can give a priest jurisdiction over you individually, or to give a mission in your parish church for a certain time, whatever. That's delegated jurisdiction. Your bishop, though, your diocesan bishop, also can grant jurisdiction to priests within his diocese. It's often done with the assistants to the pastor. Will receive jurisdiction either for the parish, or as is common in the United States, a priest will receive jurisdiction for the whole of the diocese. And so that's a delegated jurisdiction. Your pastor cannot grant jurisdiction to another priest. And so these are the people that can validly absolve you from sins. No other priest can. Let's look at the traditionalists. The traditionalists are merely sacramental priests. I discussed this in a separate video about sacramental priests and bishops. And they possess no authority whatsoever, and they readily admit this. Since they do not have authority, they cannot validly absolve you from your sins in the sacrament of confession. There is one exception where every valid priest can validly absolve from all sins and all censures. That means excommunications, suspensions, interdicts, and that is a danger of death. And this provision is given for the good of the faithful. If you're dying and a priest comes along and offers to hear your confession, give you absolution, you haven't got time to question, well, do you have authority from the bishop? Or if he says, oh, no, okay, I'll call the bishop right quick. No, he needs to proceed at once. That is for your good, because you're dying. If you weren't dying, they wouldn't have to proceed at once. I have posted a separate video on epikeia because it is claimed in the early 1980s, Bishop Gerard de Laurier and Father Robert McKenna, writing around the same time. I don't know if Father McKenna was influenced by Bishop de Laurier or not. It didn't appear to be from the article I read. They propose that epikeia in the Great Apostasy, in this emergency, grants emergency jurisdiction. That's what Father J. Vita Elmer claimed, that priests have emergency jurisdiction because of the times. I don't know if that applies or not. One could come up with a probable opinion that they would have emergency jurisdiction until the crisis was ended. And that under Can 209 would grant temporary jurisdiction. In other words, Can 209 would supply, because there is a probable doubt of factor of law. Now, with the problem with epikeia, which, as I discussed in my other video, okay, they run out because of the fire in the town. They don't set up a bucket brigade to put out the fire. Epikeia has become a way of life in traditionalism, and the principle is not for regular things. It is for emergencies. The emergency should be ended. The traditionalists don't want to end the emergency, and therefore I would doubt God would continue to grant them jurisdiction when they're doing absolutely nothing to end the emergency. Now I could see, because at the same time epikeia was being voiced in around 1983, the Took bishops were talking about electing a pope. They could say, okay, we have emergency jurisdiction while we're getting this papal election together until we can restore ordinary authority. That argument would at least be probable, and Canon 209 would provide jurisdiction if the argument was not eventually accepted by the Pope elected. The Catholic Church is hierarchical. The Church needs a living, breathing Pope. A living, breathing bishop over each diocese, and priests subject to the Pope and their own bishop, operating ordinarily. Okay, in mission territories it's a similar setup. They need authority that can trace itself through the Pope back to Jesus Christ. Outside this structure you have a different church, not the Catholic Church. A church with absolutely no authority from Christ, and thus no authority to absolve from sins in the sacrament of confession. I know this is a hard saying. This is not something we want to hear. I didn't want to hear it when I was figuring it out. But I realized these priests cannot validly absolve me from my sins. And they cannot legitimately operate. So we have to leave them. When I found out we could elect a pope, I said, at least we got a way to restore this. Put things back on a right course. So let's get back on course. And so, on this Fish Eater Friday, I've given you a hard saying. And for your penance, accept the truth and do what it requires of you. God bless you on this Fish Eater Friday.